Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein didn't just get away with it once, he got away with it twice, and the second time, he conveniently died in a maximum security federal prison while on suicide watch, in a cell where the cameras mysteriously stopped working, where his cellmate had been transferred out the day before, and where the guards, who were supposed to check on him every 30 minutes, somehow forgot to do that, for like 8 hours. Now, the official ruling is suicide, and sure, maybe, but here's the thing about Jeffrey Epstein. This was a guy who had the phone numbers of presidents, princes, and billionaires stored in a little black book. A guy who ran what federal prosecutors described as one of the largest and most sophisticated sex trafficking operations in American history. A guy who somehow, in 2008, when he was first caught, managed to negotiate a secret plea deal so sweetheart that the prosecutor who signed it, Alexander Acosta, later had to resign from his position as Secretary of Labor just because someone remembered he'd done that. The 2008 deal. Let's talk about the 2008 deal for a second, because it is genuinely one of the most insane legal documents in American history. Epstein was accused of sexually abusing at least 36 underage girls in Palm Beach, Florida. The FBI built a case. Prosecutors built a case, victims came forward, and then, quietly, behind closed doors, without notifying the victims, which, by the way, was illegal, a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges of soliciting prostitution, not federal trafficking charges, not abuse charges. Soliciting prostitution. He got 18 months in a private wing of a county jail, work release 6 days a week, and his own private security detail. He was allowed to leave jail for up to 16 hours a day, to go to his office. He served 13 months, then he walked free. The victims found out about the deal from a newspaper, and then he did it again. For years. His island, his plane, the Lolita Express, a name so on the nose it sounds like a bad guy's yacht in a direct-to-video action movie. His network, all of it kept running, kept growing, until 2019, when he was finally arrested on federal charges. Finally, the system was going to work. He was denied bail, he was put in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, and then, 6 weeks later, he was dead. The cameras were not working. His cellmate had been moved, the guards were asleep, or doing paperwork, or both. They later admitted to falsifying log entries, by the way. Both guards were charged. Both eventually got deferred prosecution, of course. The medical examiner ruled it suicide by hanging. A private forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's brother ruled it homicide. And we're just living with that open question, with the fact that the one man who could have named every single person in his network died before he could say a word in open court. His co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, was eventually convicted in 2021, sentenced to 20 years for sex trafficking. But when asked during the trial to name the powerful men who abused victims, prosecutors didn't really push that hard. The list of names in the unsealed documents is long, very long. Most of them have faced 0 consequences. 0. Some of them are probably watching this video right now. Al Capone. Al Capone was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most violent and prolific criminals in American history. He ran organized crime in Chicago throughout the 1920s. He ordered murders. He orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall and shot. He bribed politicians, judges, police officers, and basically anyone who could be bribed, which in Prohibition-era Chicago was essentially everyone. He was untouchable. Literally, no one would testify against him. No one who valued their continued existence as a living person. Anyway, witnesses had a funny habit of becoming unavailable. Juries had a funny habit of being sympathetic, and Capone walked around Chicago like he owned the place, which, functionally, he did. So what finally brought him down? Murder? Racketeering? Running an empire of violence and corruption that made entire neighborhoods unlivable? No. Taxes. The federal government got Al Capone on tax evasion. He'd made millions and millions of dollars, and shockingly, had not reported any of it to the IRS. This is technically a crime. It is not the crime that should have put him away. It is not the crime that his victims, the people he had murdered, the communities he had destroyed, deserved to see prosecuted, but it was the only thing that stuck. He was sentenced to 11 years in 1931. He served 7, got out early because he had advanced syphilis, and his brain was essentially leaving him. He spent his remaining years at his mansion in Florida, confused, increasingly disconnected from reality, and very much unpunished for the actual worst things he'd done. The murders, never prosecuted. The massacre, never charged. The empire, it just kept going without him. The lesson America apparently took from this is, make sure criminals pay their taxes. Which, fine, as lessons go, at least it's something. Sackler family. Here is a fun game. Go to a prestigious museum, the Met, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the Smithsonian, literally anywhere, and look at how many things are named after the Sackler family. Wings, galleries, libraries, study centers. The Sacklers have donated so much money to cultural institutions that their name is essentially wallpapered across the most prestigious cultural spaces in the Western world. Now, here is another fact. The Sackler family owns Purdue Pharma, the company that made OxyContin, and the deliberate, calculated, extraordinarily well-documented campaign to aggressively market it as a non-addictive painkiller to doctors across America is directly responsible for launching the opioid epidemic, an epidemic that has killed, depending on how you count, somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 Americans since the late 1990s. That is more Americans than died in World War II. Purdue Pharma knew OxyContin was addictive. Internal documents showed they knew. They had sales representatives specifically trained to dismiss and downplay concerns about addiction. They paid doctors to prescribe it. They marketed it for conditions that didn't require it. They pushed dosages that were dangerous. They watched communities, entire towns, entire counties, entire states collapse into addiction and death, and they kept going. They kept pushing because it was making them personally billions of dollars. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding and paid $600 million in fines, which sounds like a lot until you realize they'd made roughly $35 billion from OxyContin. In 2021, they pleaded guilty again, this time to criminal charges, and paid $8.3 billion. Purdue Pharma entered bankruptcy. The company was restructured. The Sacklers personally, in the 2021 settlement, they paid about $4.5 billion. They were granted broad immunity from civil lawsuits, not because a court found them innocent, because it was negotiated. The Supreme Court later struck down part of that immunity deal in 2024, which is something. But as of right now, no individual member of the Sackler family has been criminally charged for any of this. They did, quietly, agree to have their names removed from some museum wings, so that's the punishment. No name on the wall at the Louvre for 500,000 dead people. One of the most chilling details in all of this is an internal Purdue document from the early 2000s when the epidemic was already visibly exploding. A family member, reviewing sales strategy, wrote a memo about ways to capitalize on the addiction crisis, to sell more product to more addicted people, while knowing what was happening. No charges. Their names are just on slightly fewer walls now. Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe, used to be called the breadbasket of Africa. That is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Zimbabwe was one of the most agriculturally productive countries on the entire continent. It exported food, it fed its neighbors, it had a functioning economy, a relatively strong currency, and genuine potential. Then Robert Mugabe happened. Mugabe ruled Zimbabwe from 1980, when it gained independence, until 2017, when he was removed in a military coup at age 93. That is 37 years. During those 37 years, he ran one of the most systematically destructive regimes in modern African history. He oversaw the Gukurahundi massacres in the early 1980s, where his military killed an estimated 20,000 civilians from the Ndebele ethnic group in a campaign that human rights organizations have described as genocide. He destroyed Zimbabwe's agricultural economy through a violent and chaotic land reform program that drove out experienced farmers and collapsed food production. He printed money until inflation reached, and this is a real number, 89.7 sextillion% in November 2008. Zimbabwe had to issue a $100 trillion banknote. It was worth about 40 US cents. Life expectancy in Zimbabwe dropped to 37 years for women and 34 for men during his rule. 34, in a country that had been doing fine 20 years earlier. Mugabe and his inner circle, meanwhile, accumulated vast personal wealth. His wife, Grace, nicknamed Gucci Grace by Zimbabweans, became famous for shopping trips to Europe while the country was in famine. They had mansions, they had accounts, they had luxury cars, they had a very good time while running a country into total collapse. When the military finally removed him in 2017, there was a brief moment where the world wondered, will he face justice? Will there be tribunals? Will anyone be held accountable for the massacres, the economic destruction, the decades of theft? He negotiated his resignation in exchange for immunity. He kept his pension. He kept his properties. He kept everything. He retired to his mansion, lived another 2 years, and died in 2019 at age 95 in a private hospital in Singapore, natural causes. Not a single day in court, not a single charge, just a very long life, very comfortably lived, on the money he stole from one of the poorest countries on earth. Catholic Church. This one is harder to be glib about because the scale of it is genuinely staggering, and the victims are real and their suffering is real, but we're going to talk about it because if we're making a list of crimes that went unpunished, leaving this off would be dishonest. The systematic sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests, and the systematic concealment of that abuse by the church hierarchy over decades, in some documented cases, over centuries, is one of the largest institutional cover-ups in human history. The John Jay Report in the United States, commissioned by the church itself, found that roughly 4% of all Catholic priests serving between 1950 and 2002 had faced allegations of sexual abuse of minors. That's approximately 10,667 priests. Over 10,000 victims came forward in the US alone, and the pattern, revealed by investigation after investigation, in Ireland, in Australia, in Germany, in Chile, in France, everywhere, was the same. A priest was accused. The diocese moved him to a different parish. Told no one. The priest abused again. The diocese moved him again. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Victims were told to stay quiet. Their families were pressured. Some were paid off. Some were gaslit into believing they were lying or misremembering. The church protected the institution. The church protected the priests. And for decades, it largely worked. Some individual priests have been convicted. Some dioceses have paid enormous settlements. The U.S. Catholic Church has paid out over $4 billion in abuse-related settlements. Pope Francis has acknowledged the abuse, apologized, made statements, established commissions. But here's the part that goes unpunished: the cover-up. The bishops and cardinals and officials who knew, who moved priests, who silenced victims, who actively obstructed justice. The vast majority of them face no criminal charges. Cardinal Bernard Law, who oversaw the Boston Archdiocese at the center of the most extensively documented cover-up in American history, was not charged with a crime. He was moved to Rome, given a ceremonial position at the Vatican, and died in 2017, in Rome, with full honors. The institution that protected the abusers is still largely run by people who protected the abusers. And because it's a sovereign entity, the Vatican is technically a country. It has been almost entirely able to avoid the kind of legal accountability that would destroy any other organization. Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Ford. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. He was, for literally the rest of his life, he died in November 2023 at age 100, treated as a distinguished elder statesman, sought out by presidents for counsel, celebrated by foreign policy establishments, given honorary degrees and awards and profiles in prestigious magazines. He was also, by a very credible reading of documented historical evidence, responsible for policies that led directly to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War, which Kissinger championed, which was conducted without congressional knowledge or approval, which violated Cambodian neutrality, killed an estimated 150,000 civilians. It destabilized Cambodia so severely that it created the conditions for the Khmer Rouge to take power. The Khmer Rouge then killed approximately 1.7 million people. Kissinger didn't order the Khmer Rouge, but the chain of causation is not subtle. He supported the 1973 coup in Chile that overthrew Salvador Allende and brought Pinochet to power. Pinochet's regime tortured and murdered thousands of people. Kissinger's response, as documented in declassified State Department cables, was essentially, "Great, good work, let us know if you need anything." He authorized wiretapping of journalists and his own staff. He supported the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, which led to a genocide that killed roughly a third of the Timorese population. He gave a green light to Argentina's military junta during the Dirty War, during which thousands of people were disappeared and murdered. For many of these actions, there were formal legal attempts in multiple countries. Spain issued a request for his testimony. He simply didn't go. France served him a summons. He left the country. No jurisdiction was ever able to compel him to appear. And in America, these things were treated as matters of foreign policy debate, not criminal law. He died at 100, surrounded by accolades, with 100 think pieces asking what his legacy meant for the future of American diplomacy, a Nobel Peace Prize on his shelf. 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed because major banks had spent years doing something that was, depending on which lawyer you ask, either just barely legal or flagrantly fraudulent, packaging terrible mortgages. Mortgages given to people who could not repay them, often with hidden terms, sometimes through outright deception, into financial products that were rated as safe investments, selling them to pension funds and institutional investors around the world, and collecting enormous fees and bonuses for doing so, while knowing at some level that the underlying assets were garbage. When it collapsed, it wiped out approximately $13 trillion in household wealth in the United States. Millions of people lost their homes, unemployment doubled, the global economy entered the worst recession since the 1930s. Countries in Europe had to be bailed out. Regular people who had nothing to do with derivatives or mortgage-backed securities, lost their savings, their jobs, their houses. The banks were bailed out with approximately $700 billion in public money through TARP. The Federal Reserve lent out trillions more through emergency programs. The banks survived. They paid bonuses that year. Large bonuses, really quite astonishing bonuses. How many senior banking executives went to prison for the financial crisis? 1. Karim Saragildin, a mid-level Credit Suisse trader, served 2.5 years for hiding losses. He is the only person to have served prison time in connection with the financial crisis. One person. The Department of Justice under Obama later acknowledged that it had chosen not to aggressively pursue criminal cases against large banks because it feared doing so would further destabilize the financial system. The concept became known as too big to jail. Banks paid fines. Goldman Sachs paid $5 billion. Bank of America paid $16.65 billion. JP Morgan paid $13 billion. These are real numbers. They are also, for these institutions, manageable numbers. The fines were, functionally, a cost of doing business. No admission of criminal wrongdoing was required. Nobody went to prison. The people who crashed the global economy, who wiped out trillions of dollars of ordinary people's wealth, who caused immeasurable human suffering. They got fined in amounts their companies could absorb, and they went home. Some of them are still running major financial institutions. Unit 731. This is the darkest one on this list. Be warned. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated in Manchuria during World War II. Between 1935 and 1945, it conducted human experimentation on a scale that rivals, and in some respects exceeds, anything done by Nazi scientists. Prisoners, primarily Chinese, Korean, Soviet, and Allied POWs, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. They were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. They were subjected to frostbite experiments, pressure experiments, and were used to test flamethrowers and grenades. Estimates of the number of people killed range from 3,000 to over 200,000. The commander of Unit 731 was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. He supervised all of it. After the war, Ishii and the leadership of Unit 731 were not charged at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Not tried, not mentioned. The United States government made a deliberate, documented decision to grant them immunity in exchange for their research data. The data on biological weapons, on human responses to disease and injury, on the results of experiments that had killed tens of thousands of people. That data was considered valuable enough that the American government decided the people who produced it did not need to face justice. Researchers from Unit 731 went on to have successful post-war careers in medicine, academia, and business in Japan. Shiro Ishii died in 1959 at home of throat cancer, having never faced any formal accountability whatsoever. The Soviet Union did try some Unit 731 members at the Khabarovsk war crime trials in 1949 and received Western skepticism at the time because it was politically inconvenient during the Cold War, which means the most meaningful attempt to hold Unit 731 accountable was dismissed partly for geopolitical reasons. This one keeps legal scholars and historians up at night. It is the starkest documented example of superpower interest actively overriding justice, explicitly and on the record. The research was, to put a sharp point on it, completely inadmissible as scientific evidence in any legitimate context today because it came from atrocities. But the atrocities were committed, and the people who committed them made a deal, and they went home. Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein is technically in prison. He was convicted in New York in 2020 and California in 2023, so he doesn't fully belong on this list. But here's why he's on it. Everyone knew for 30 years. Not rumors, not whispers. Knew. His behavior was an industry-wide open secret. There were jokes about him at award ceremonies. Journalists had the story. Multiple journalists, multiple outlets. For years before it was published, women were routinely warned about him when they entered the industry. His own company's board was aware. His brother knew. His colleagues knew. The New Yorker and the New York Times finally published the investigations in October 2017 that triggered the hashtag #MeToo movement. Those investigations existed because sources finally went on the record. Before that, nothing. Decades of nothing. This is the unpunished part. Not just Harvey Weinstein personally, but the entire system that protected him. The lawyers who drafted NDAs, the companies that enforced them, the executives who looked the other way, the colleagues who knew and stayed silent, the industry that built a culture in which this was not only possible, impossible but sustainable for 3 decades. Some of those people are still working. Some of them are still powerful. Some of them are still giving each other awards. The Weinstein case became the symbol for #MeToo, and #MeToo changed some things. Genuinely, more women came forward, more cases were prosecuted, more NDAs were scrutinized, but the machinery that enabled it, the culture of silence, the power differentials, the weaponized legal agreements, that machinery still largely exists.